Hey friends, it's Just the Gems, I'm Brandon. Maybe you don't know this about me, but the Trails series is my absolute favorite long-form story, period. That's right, in terms of books, movies, TV shows, video games, the Trails series is my favorite story. It's so epic and sprawling, and it's full of so many interesting characters that if you have the patience to let it grow on you, it's impossible to stop. But where do you start is the question. It can be overwhelming to get into a series of around a dozen 40 to 60 hour video games. With a lot of game series, the temptation is just to pick it up with the latest entry. And game publishers want to assure you that this latest entry is the best place to jump on board. For a lot of reasons, that's my least favorite way to tackle a new series. I want to see the progression. Even for a series where the games don't necessarily connect on a story level, I still enjoy watching the evolution of the gameplay from one entry to the next. And starting with a later entry, then jumping back into previous entries, well, let's just say sometimes the developers have made some much needed improvements to the gameplay experience, which can make tackling an older game a bit harder than it needs to be. But not everyone is like me, and look, I'm not about to tell anyone they're doing Trails wrong. If you're playing Trails, you're part of the family as far as I'm concerned. I definitely have my own opinion about the best place to start. However, I want to step outside of my own limited experience and try to make the case for a few entry points to the series. So I'm going to cover these in no particular order. Stick around so you can decide which is your preference. And if you find this interesting or useful, would you consider subscribing? I promise I'll keep working to bring you content that you like. And speaking of likes, please? Helps a ton. Thanks. Trails of Cold Steel tells the story of Rien Schwarzer, the son of a minor nobleman who's been accepted to Thor's military academy in the Empire of Erebonia. He's a good-natured guy, nice to a fault, and from what we can see, he comes from a background that's sort of wealthy but humble at the same time. It's like if Scrooge McDuck had the personality of, I don't know, Gobo from Fraggle Rock. Yeah, I nailed that analogy. Thor's military academy is starkly divided between the children of nobles and the children of commoners. However, Rien's class, he comes to learn, is sort of an experiment since it contains students of both backgrounds. This leads to all sorts of conflicts in the early parts of the story. Machias and uses. Much of the story in Cold Steel Part 1 revolves around the students visiting various locales throughout the Empire on their field studies, learning about the different regions, and solving problems together. In the background, it's clear that there are some political tensions starting to boil over, and Rien and his classmates encounter the effects of that continuously throughout the story, until everything finally comes to a head in the finale. Okay, now, I'm gonna be honest, and a little harsh. Not a lot happens in Cold Steel 1. And look, I'm saying this as a guy that loves Cold Steel 1, but if the purpose of this video is to present you with arguments for and against various starting points in the Trails series, then I gotta make like Emily and James, and be blunt. As a general rule, the first game in each of the arcs focuses significantly more on world and character building than the subsequent entries of that arc. Cold Steel is the longest arc with 4 entries, and it seems to be, proportionally speaking, the one with the most world-buildingest introduction. Now, coming into Cold Steel as a fan of the Trails series already, I didn't mind this at all. In fact, like I said, I loved it. But as a fresh-faced fan with no context, well, your mileage may vary. So that's the con. It's a slow start. But how about the pros? I'm going to give my audience the benefit of the doubt and assume that graphics aren't everything to you. But I will say this. Cold Steel is definitely the most modern-looking entry of the series to that point. If the Playmobil-looking sprites of Sky and Crossbell wigged you out too much, hey, at least the characters are all 3D over here. In terms of the story, the events of Cold Steel are far enough removed from the events of Trails in the Sky that there are only a handful of overt mentions. There are some very, very cool revelations for longtime fans of the series to see if they've at least played the Sky games beforehand, but your understanding of the overall story won't be impaired too much if you start the saga here. The next point could be considered a positive, but I think of it as more neutral. The events of Cold Steel 1 and 2 are essentially happening in parallel to the events of Trails from Zero and Trails to Azure, aka the Crossbell duology. This means that, theoretically, you could play Cold Steel 1 and 2, and then play Zero and Azure without much of an impact on your overall understanding of the story. However, you do have to keep in mind that the writers of the story intended it to be told in the order they released the games, so once again, there are cool moments and revelations that read differently if you're playing the games out of sequence. As far as the gameplay goes, Cold Steel 1 shows the continuing refinement that Falcom kept putting into each subsequent Trails game over the years. I guess you could argue that this is another point in the pro column, but if this is your starting point, you won't notice any of those improvements, so I'm not sure how to classify it. I guess having a highly refined battle system is a positive, sure. Battles are turn-based, and your character's positioning on the field of battle impacts what enemies they can attack based on their weapon's reach, as well as the effects of special attacks. See a bunch of enemies clustered together, use an area of effect attack. Enemies spread out all over, then hit them one by one or spend a lot of CP on a crushing screen-wide special attack. Your magic is handled in a similar way, only measured in EP instead of CP, and spells have a variety of typical JRPG effects, elemental attacks, and buffs and debuffs. The gimmick in this game is combat links. You can partner each of your characters up with one another on the battlefield, and that comes with a variety of benefits. Your bonds between characters can be leveled up, which increases the usefulness of the combat links. It's a pretty cool system, and it continues to be refined throughout the Cold Steel arc. There's also a sort of, I guess, Persona-light social aspect to Cold Steel that isn't really present in the other arcs. If you're a fan of spending limited free time choosing which character to form relationships with, you'll probably like this, but I, for one, find the lack of a canon love interest for Reen to be a bit of a bummer. So, if I were to assign the viability of starting the Trails series with Cold Steel a number from 1 to 10, I guess I'd give it a 5. It's possible to get into Trails with Cold Steel. However, there are better options. Speaking of which. The Crossbell duology is made up of Trails from Zero and Trails to Azure, which I'm going to just take a minute and say these are probably not actually very good titles. I get that they're very literal, Zero no Kiseki and Ao no Kiseki, but the rest of the games wisely avoid using a super literal translation of the Japanese title and instead give them titles that A, sound cool, and B, actually mean something substantial. Like, if Cold Steel had been translated this way, the third arc in the Trails series, which is Sen no Kiseki, would have been something ridiculous like Trails of Flash or whatever. That's bad. I think they kept the names of Zero and Azure in honor of the fan team that did the vast majority of the translation work on the game, but I disagree with the thought behind the names, or the lack of thought, I guess. I fully expect to be flamed for that. Please, feel free to direct your rage to the comments below, and maybe I'm speaking in ignorance, so if I am, inform me. Make me better. Anyway, Zero begins with Lloyd Bannings, fresh-faced kid who's just graduated from police academy and is making his way back to his home city of Crossbell to become a police officer. He's teamed up with 3 other new recruits. You've got Ellie, the super polite sharpshooter. You've got Tio, the 8th grade girl who is somehow a police officer because she's a genius and also because anime. And you've got Randy, whose name is very fitting because he certainly does like the ladies. These 4 form the Special Support Section, or SSS, which dodges the World War II Germany Association by 1 lucky S. Now, in Crossbell, the police are not well liked. It's because the people don't think they're reliable enough to actually do their jobs. So the SSS has been formed to help improve the department's image. They do this by tackling even the most menial of jobs for the citizens of Crossbell, from monster extermination to overdue library book returning. Oops, I think I just made their job sound boring. The library book thing is an optional side quest. You can be as cool as you want to be in this game. I just choose to be lame. So as they progress through their daily routine, the members of the SSS find themselves getting embroiled in events that have the capacity to send the entire city-state of Crossbell into turmoil. This might sound more interesting to you than my description of Cold Steel 1's story, which I think I summed up as essentially a bunch of kids going on field trips while politicians start getting ready for war in the background. I'm kidding, it's much better than that, but I will concede that the story and setting of Zero are much more interesting than Cold Steel 1. The battle system is, of course, a step back from Cold Steel. No combat links or anything, but the core of the system is the same and it's still enjoyable. Plus, playing it on modern consoles, you have the option to increase the speed, which means battles don't have to feel like they're dragging in that old school JRPG way. Trails from Zero is actually a pretty fantastic place to start the Trails series from. You'll be missing some really cool moments by bypassing the Sky trilogy, but if saving money and time is worth it to you, then you could do far worse. But if you want to do far better, then let me recommend. Trails in the Sky is, at first glance, a very unassuming JRPG. I'll admit, I purchased it digitally on the Vita and proceeded to let it sit there on my home screen for years before I actually gave it a try. With a series named like Legend of Heroes, I don't know, it just seemed kinda generic. I mean, it still seemed like it would be up my alley in a general sense. It was more or less a classic-style JRPG with airships and anime characters and empires at war, but I wasn't motivated to try it. What it hides behind that kind of bland name, however, are the opening chapters of something pretty spectacular. In Trails in the Sky, you're introduced to the Kingdom of Liberl specifically, the continent of Zemuria more broadly, and many of the key characters who will have significant roles to play throughout the rest of the broader Trails series. You play as Estelle, who is the Bestelle, and I will not hear arguments to the contrary on this point. She's a spunky kid who's following in her father's footsteps to become a bracer. Bracers are essentially mercenaries for hire that tackle jobs for clients. But they have an upstanding moral code, so there's not that Blackwater private military sort of association with the bracers. They're good guys. So Estelle and her adopted brother Joshua are required to travel all around the nation of Liberl, reporting in at each major bracer headquarters and tackling jobs to prove they have what it takes to become full-fledged bracers. It's sort of picaresque, to use one of the words I feel obligated to throw into videos from time to time in order to validate my college loans. Lots of traveling around, meeting new people, fighting powerful monsters. It's all good, fun stuff. And the cast of characters that end up joining you along the way are all very cool and well-rounded too. I won't go into detail, but I will use one of them as an example of why I think it's so important to begin your Trails journey with Sky. Let's talk about Olivier. Olivier serves as the particularly over-the-top comic relief character. He's lecherous and loud and gets into all sorts of, shenanigans. He does shenanigans. Now, if I were a betting man, I wouldn't have put any money on Olivier playing a significant role in the series just based off his initial portrayal. I would have lost that bet. Olivier's importance to the greater series is pretty freaking huge, actually, and the effect of learning more about him in subsequent games is largely deflated if you skip these opening chapters. And while Olivier is a main party member in Trails in the Sky, he's really more of a secondary player in the overall arc story. Estelle is so incredibly endearing that honestly I wouldn't have been sad if she were the main character of every Trails game. But she and her brother/lover Joshua, did I mention this game is anime as heck? They're not actually blood related, so technically it's fine or whatever, but still gross, come on. Anyway, the two of them go on to play a significant role in the whole story as well. Honestly, if you can play 3 whole Trails in the Sky games without being charmed to death by Estelle, I wonder if you might not be an actual person. Double check and make sure you're not an AI bot. It's fine if you are an AI bot, I don't discriminate, but that's something you'll want to know about yourself, I'm sure. Getting introduced to these characters through their own story makes their future appearances all the more impactful. The closest analog I can think of is, do you like Marvel movies? I'm not crazy about them, but I watched all of them up until Avengers Endgame. Starting the Trails series in the middle would be sort of like watching the original Avengers movie without watching all the preceding character-specific movies. Sure, you'd probably still have a fun time at the movies, but you're missing so much foundation on which to build your fandom. Inside jokes and nods to previous works will fly over your head. You won't know you missed them, of course, because you don't know what you don't know, but your experience is enhanced significantly by investing the time in the previous entries. And I haven't even mentioned the big bads of the entire series, the secret organization Ouroboros. No, not that Ouroboros. No, not that Ouroboros, it's a different one. Japanese writers love the mythical Ouroboros though, huh? Anywho, their members show up throughout each of the arcs, and while some of them are far more present in certain arcs than others, there's a great deal of crossover. So we get to see some good character development even on the villain side of things. After something like 10 games, their motivations are still somewhat mysterious, though a lot was definitely finally revealed in Cold Steel 4, and it appears that perhaps even more is going to come out in Trails Into Reverie, so I'm looking forward to that. But anyway, point is, starting with Trails in the Sky gives you the proper and full introduction to Ouroboros that they deserve. Now let's talk about the gameplay. Like I've been saying, each new entry in the series iterates on the systems of the games before it, creating a progression from good to amazing. Is that the same as me saying that the battle system in Trails in the Sky is the worst in the entire series? Well, yeah, it is. Not to say that it's bad, it's actually pretty great. The improvements to the battle system in the Crossbell arc, and particularly in the latter half of the Cold Steel arc, are so much easier to appreciate when you come in with this foundational experience. But this foundational experience is still a very solid battle system in its own right. It doesn't have some of the bells and whistles from subsequent arcs, but it didn't need them to be great back then, and it doesn't need them to be great today. All that being said, each arc of the story, the Sky Trilogy, the Crossbell Duology, and the Cold Steel Quadrology? Is that a word? But each arc does tell its own fairly self-contained story, it's true. And like I said at the beginning, you're not wrong for starting with any arc. If something in Crossbell catches your interest in a way that neither of the other arcs does, then go for it. But if you're interested in this story, I hope you'll return to the Sky Trilogy and get the whole plot from the start. Picking the wrong entry point can be deadly. Not like physically, but to your potential fandom. Let me give you an example. My brother heard me raving about the Trails games for a long time, and he finally bit the bullet and picked up Trails of Cold Steel 1. He gave it a fair shot, but he had to tell me that unfortunately it just didn't grab him. While I was bummed to hear that, it sort of makes sense to me. Starting a long-running series of fantasy novels on book 6 seems far from ideal, and it's the same here. Just read up a bit on each of the arcs to find your own ideal entry point to minimize the chance that you'll be put off and miss out on this amazing series. Shout out to my brother, by the way. You rule, Aaron! Woo. You are an agent of chaos. You might be a nihilist. You are a crazy person. Nah, I'm just kidding. I obviously don't know a ton about Trails into Reverie since it's not out yet, and I avoid information on the Japanese version like the plague, so maybe it's structured as a great way to enter the series. But I kinda doubt it. It employs at least 3 different main characters, and at least 2 of them are the main characters from 2 of the previous Trails arcs. So chances are there's gonna be an expectation that the player will have a certain level of knowledge. Maybe they'll put in an encyclopedia or something, a detailed recap of events thus far. But is that how you want to experience the story? As a Wikipedia page? No. If you've watched a video on the Trails series for this long, you're at least interested enough that you would want to see these events for yourself. If I find that Falcom has devised the cleverest and most satisfying method of recapping new players, I'll put out a new video and eat crow. No, not him, it's just an expression. But assuming that's not the case, start elsewhere. You want to start with Nayuta? I mean, sure. I think that's fine. It's the least overtly connected to the rest of the series, so yeah, cool. Just, keep in mind that it's a completely different type of game so that you're not surprised when you start one of the other games and suddenly everyone's politely taking turns in battle. Everyone is in a rush with video games these days. We all bemoan our backlogs, and the idea of throwing hundreds of more hours worth of games on top of the stack seems untenable. I get it. But look, Trails isn't going anywhere. This isn't something you have to rush through. Take the pressure off yourself and just enjoy the ride. Maybe plan on completing 1 Trails game a year. By the time you catch up with the latest entry, who knows, maybe the US releases will finally have caught up with the Japanese. I have a feeling though that if you commit to 1 Trails a year, you'll find yourself making time for 1 or 2, or maybe even 3 more. What do you think is the best entry point to the series if you've played the Trails games? Or if you haven't played them, do any of my descriptions find you leaning in one direction or another? Let me know down in the comments. If you've made it this far, would you mind slamming on that like button? Like, really do a number on it. Make it cry. And consider subscribing too. Anyway, thanks for watching, and until next time, bye.